All right, welcome back, everybody, to our evening panel here at Consider the Lilies 2024. My name's Ryan Turnbull, and I've had the great pleasure of working with the team this year to help put this thing together. I would just love to give everybody, if everybody could give a big round of applause to Westwood Community Church for being a great partner here. And to Arasha, their staff have made this possible in more ways than one. So thank you so much to Arasha. All right, so this evening, our topic is a discussion on who owns the earth. And this might be an obvious question, given that on the way into the conference today, the Arasha sign says, "The earth is the Lord's and everything therein." However, when we were kicking this around the boardroom, I think Dave mentioned a car ride with a group of friends where this question had been asked, and all sorts of answers came out of the woodwork. And we thought, I wonder what our esteemed panelists might have to say about this, where they might take this. There's a lot of non-obvious answers for this question. And so we've put this together. But before we get to the actual discussion, I wanted to just introduce our panel. You've seen some of these faces already this weekend. You've seen Dr. Michael Gilmour this afternoon giving a wonderful talk about all of God's creatures, including the animals. And Dr. Sylvia Keesmaat, obviously our keynote speaker. We've heard from her last night and this morning, and I can't wait to hear from her one more time. We're also joined by Dr. John Boopalan. He joins us from Canadian Mennonite University, and we've had the pleasure of working together on a couple of things so far. And I think you work in the area of eco-theology and post-colonial theologies, right? Yeah, so I'm excited to hear how your research kind of helps us navigate this question. And finally, my new friend, Don Buckingham. Don's joining us from Ottawa. You're the chair of the board of Arasha, that's right, and has many, many titles. Doctor, honorable, what else should I be throwing in there? Do you have a knighthood too? Yeah? The dishonorable. Has a wealth of experience in food policy, law, government, and so I'm really excited to have Don's perspective on this question, because it's easy for a bunch of theologians to sit around and be like, God, I think the answer is God. But perhaps having a lawyer at the table will help us sharpen our discussion a little bit. So we have an order set out in the panel, in the program, so I think we'll follow that. We're going to have the way this panel will proceed is each panelist will have some opening remarks for about 7-ish minutes, and then each of them have prepared or will be preparing a question to ask one of the other panelists, and then we'll open it up to the floor to have a bit more of a group discussion here. And then after this, we'll be heading over for a reception. So I'll turn it over to you now, John. Who owns the earth?
All right. Hey, everybody. Good to see everyone, and good to be on this panel. My timer has already started. There are two different styles of starting your timer. Some people start their timer after their introductory remarks. I'm not that guy. I start my timer right away. So it's on here. Who owns the earth is a great question. And I'm really looking forward to the conversation here with our fellow panelists. I was on the phone with my sister yesterday, and I was telling her about this conference, and she was looking it up as I was talking to her, and she said to me, John, you're the only one who looks different. And I didn't quite understand what she meant, and then she never spelled it out for me. She never unpacked it for me. So I was asking her, what do you mean? She said, no, you're just the one who looks different. And then I said, well, you know what? Even though you didn't spell it out for me, I think I know what you're talking about. She was talking about my height. She's talking about my height and how I'm taller than most people. And I was actually going to show you a slide about how I am actually, in fact, the tallest person in the room, but I decided not to do that. So you get only words without pictures this evening. No pictures, not even of birds or butterflies, which I was actually seriously hoping to do, but Scott steered me in a different direction, so no slides. Jokes apart, though, it is good to be here in conversation with Don, Sylvia, Michael, Ryan. Consider the Lilies 2.0. I'm not trying to say that this year's conference is better than last year's conference, or it's a better version, new, improved, no, none of that. I'm thinking actually more of Lectio Divina, in which we read the words of Scripture, contextually meditate on those words, and pray with our whole heart, right? In this way, I think this year's conference, by the same name, is an invitation, an opportunity to think and feel and pray together, deeply feeling and praying together with Jesus' words. Consider the lilies, yet another time, 2.0 in that way. When we pray these words, however, there is an interesting implication. When Jesus says, consider the lilies, it requires we have our hearts and eyes open, right? I wonder then what it might mean to pray with our eyes not closed, but open, right? Open to the lilies, open to God's creation, open to each other, open to a transforming faith that constantly invites us into a better reality. I want to leave us with three things to ponder over, and then I'll stop talking. First is start and stay small. Lilies are little things. They remind us that small continues to be beautiful in a world that is otherwise obsessed with big things. Instead of looking for big ways to change ourselves and the things around us, we could perhaps start and stay small. Some of you will certainly hear in the background the resonance of E.F. Schumacher's words in his memorable book, Small is Beautiful. As I was revisiting Schumacher's book, I could not help but think about Jesus and first century Palestine. The context recorded for us in the Gospels when Jesus appears, describing and living out the kingdom of God. Jesus' kingdom of God was precisely not like the Roman Empire, which conquered with violence, took things to make itself bigger and bigger, demanding crushing taxes, crucifying people, making the land suffer. To the contrary, the kingdom of God is like seeds scattered on the ground that sprouts into nourishing grain, even when the farmer is not looking. Right? In other words, the reign of God is not big, it's small. I invite each of you to recollect something small, right? Something small, something beautiful that you encountered this week. Just try and jog your memory a little bit. It could be a little rock, a ladybug, a butterfly, a blossoming flower, a gentle breeze, a sparrow, a child playing in the park or blowing bubbles in a front yard in your neighborhood, a blade of grass, a dragonfly, a berry plant. Something small, something beautiful, something you encountered this week. And bring that image back into your head and heart. And as you bring that image and encounter back into your head and heart, let me share a second thing to ponder over this evening. The second matter has to do with recovering our deep emotions, reaching into our emotional life. How can we recover and freshly forge emotional bonds between ourselves, with each other, and other creatures, great and small? I wish I could read all of Psalm 104 this evening, but to keep within the 8 minutes, I instead encourage you to read Psalm 104 as your meditation on this second matter to ponder over, recovering our deep emotions. Read, repeat, recite the words of Psalm 104. Find something small. Don't go for the whole psalm. Find something small in that psalm to latch on to. It will come to you as you meditate on it. A task that I hope will show you how everything is connected. There is one community of creation. We have one heart. We stand or fall together. There is a beautiful verse in the Song of Songs in which one lover, filled with emotion, tells the other, "Arise, my love, my fair one, and come. The flowers appear on the earth. The time of singing has come." If we spoke to each other and all of creation with such intention and emotion, one small effort at a time, I wonder what the world might look like, might feel like. Over against the social messaging that we sometimes get, not to be too emotional, I wonder if considering the lilies is an invitation to be filled with emotion. A third and last thing I'd like to leave with us for our collective consideration this evening is a Bible verse from Mark chapter 1. Jesus was with the wild animals. It's there. Mark 1:13. You'll recall this verse appears after Jesus resists Satan in the wilderness and before he is cared for by the angels. The verse is not hidden somewhere in the middle of the gospel. It's right there in the beginning, in chapter 1. Jesus was with the animals. Here and elsewhere, Jesus is presented in a way that indicates that neither Jesus nor the animals are in, let's attack each other. They're not in that mode, right? There is no indication of fear, nor is there the unhelpful binary of either submit or serve, right? Creation is not reduced to usefulness or threat. That binary just does not operate there. Jesus is simply with. Consider the lilies. Jesus notices a field of wild flowers, little plants. Lies herein, I think, a clue about the heart of Jesus that does not belittle flowers, does not belittle little things, but presupposes that no one owns the earth. Everything is connected. There is one community of creation. We have one heart. We stand or fall together. All right, thanks, folks.
Thank you, John. Don, who owns the earth?
So, three theologians and a lawyer walk into a church. No. Who owns the earth? God, Adam, or Satan is what we were suggested as potential owners of the earth. But I'm going to argue that ownership is not the primary problem. And maybe I'll be playing God's advocate, or maybe I'll be playing the devil's advocate. You decide. I'm really challenged by the opening statement of our abstract that ownership in the society is really a question about who is ultimately responsible for something. Training as a lawyer would say that's not at all what ownership is about. And we would start my discussion with saying, with all due respect, which means I think you're wrong. So I want to push back on that concept that the appropriate departure point for our discussion is ownership. Because in fact, my sense as a lawyer is that ownership in our society is simply a human invention, a human tool to give notice to other humans that use and enjoyment of a property or an iPhone is exclusive to that owner of the good. And on this basis, we have built a whole legal system of property law, not just in Canadian societies, but contemporary societies around the world. It would be unusual for us to go anywhere in the world and take somebody's iPhone and say, that's my iPhone. So in fact, it's really an invention of human settlement, and it doesn't deal with ultimate responsibility so much as, at its best, a societal means to prevent conflicts over who can use or enjoy that property or good. This may not fall well in your thinking. It may be offensive to you as a concept of ownership. I'm saying it's simply a tool that we use to say who gets to use something and who doesn't. However, I will grant to you that there is the nefarious side of ownership. At its worst, the concept of property law fails human flourishing in two significant ways. First, it unnecessarily divides the world into those who have and use and enjoy property and those who don't, opening up the possibility, no, I would argue the certainty of a divisiveness of us and them, and greater inequities between individuals. And we see that. We live that. We see it on the streets of Winnipeg. We see it in the majority world. And the second thing, it simply does not hold owners accountable for the maintenance, good management, or improvement of that property that they own. In fact, under traditional English law, before the advent of government regulation to prevent it, owners of property could quite literally do as they pleased. They could use it up, they could burn it up, they could waste it, they could destroy it. And so simply, that is a huge failing of the concept of property law at its worst in human society. So we have these two extremes of property ownership preventing human conflict on the one hand through the effective use of rights and accountability versus the whole notion that property is mine and is to be excluded. So how does that square with our Christian worldview? I want to look at two Psalms very briefly and see that there are potential nuggets, jewels, as to how we get through this conundrum of preventing conflict or absolute non-accountability for use. Psalm 24. The earth, not going to be a mystery to you, the earth is the Lord's and everything in it, and the world and all who live in it. For he founded it on the seas and established it on the waters. Who may ascend the mountain of the Lord? Who may stand in his holy place? The one who has clean hands and a pure heart, who does not trust an idol or swear by a false god. Now consider Psalm 115. May you be blessed by the Lord, the maker of heaven and earth. The highest heavens belong to the Lord, but the earth he has given to mankind. It is not the dead who praise the Lord, those who go down into the place of silence. It is we who extol the Lord both now and forever. So what's common in these two passages is not who owns the earth. God owns it in the one, on Psalm 24, and it's being handed over unencumbered to man in Psalm 115, but rather it is the approach that humans must have when they use the property to raise crops, to raise families, and that in both cases, it is incumbent on us as human beings to come forward to the Lord in a posture of exuberant praise, extolling the Lord, and with clean hands and a pure heart. Which is a lot like coming in humility. It's a lot like repenting from our selfish and destructive ways. So, from my perspective, ownership of the earth is the wrong question. We do have ownership of bits and pieces of it, but the villain is not the concept of ownership, the villain is the human heart. broken after Adam's sin and then restored to a second chance after Jesus' sacrifice on the cross. Ownership of the earth and the individual bits and pieces will be used by Satan to create division and inequality among humans. That's what Satan is known for. Yet ownership may also be used by humans to maintain the earth through three different kinds of ownership. Individual holdings. Who doesn't love those people who maintain the earth on their front lawns? Who doesn't love those people who create special habitat in community-based places? Winnipeg, perfect example. River parks, Croca Curl. All of those wonderful possibilities about using this land to build community. And who doesn't love them when we use property in international community gatherings and settings, whether it's to combat biodiversity loss, fight climate change, or rebalance human inequities. So when the rubber hits the road, I think what we have to do is not change ownership, but change human hearts. We need to come before the Lord with clean hands and with contrite hearts. And let me just leave you with three little possibilities of what the law can do and can't do. It can't really move the needle very far. Social movements can't move the needle very far. But what we do need are concrete steps to change the human heart. And so I extend these possibilities. One is, whether you're a Christian or not, is a recognition that careless consumption of the earth's resources is not really a great idea. It's not getting us very far. It's not sustainable. And so let's join into those personal, community, and global plans to care and preserve and ameliorate the earth's current resources. We might even be able to do that with non-Christians. Think of it. If we are Christians, then our faith requires us an attitude of humility and towards our Creator God and the responsible use of resources. And probably what I love is one of the translations of the first two verses of Psalm 23, "The Lord is my shepherd, I lack nothing." So if you don't lack anything, don't buy any more. Let's cut down our consumptive ways. And thirdly, God's promise in Jeremiah 29:11 is this: "For I know all the plans I have for you, declares the Lord, plans to prosper you and not to harm you, plans to give you hope and a future." So if we claim that promise, if we find joy in our creation care work, and we're committed more to that than to the accumulation of property, we will have an exuberant praise championing activities that promote rather than destroy God's creation. And whether we own that property or not, some people might see that this is a pretty cool way to live their life and join the party.
Thank you very much. So for those keeping score, we have nobody owns the earth. We have ownership isn't about what I said it's about. Michael, who owns the earth?
There's a lot of Psalm 104 going on in this conference, so here's some more. Psalm 104 is a hymn of praise to the Creator. It affirms the earth is the Lord's, but also takes us beyond that assertion. The opening 9 verses tell us the Lord set the earth on its foundations, separated water from land, and brought order out of chaos, in language recalling Genesis 1. But at verse 10, it shifts from this vision of the Creator in isolation, stretching out the heavens like a tent in verse 2, riding the clouds like a chariot in verse 3, assigning the mountains and waters and land to their proper places, to a vision of the Creator interacting with the earth community. The poet marvels at the Lord's extravagance. "How manifold are your works! The earth is full of your creatures," verse 24. Those creatures belong to the Lord, ownership, but we also glimpse another kind of ownership. To put it awkwardly, God gives creation to creation. God makes springs gush so every wild animal can drink, verses 10 and 11. So trees might have nourishment and they in turn offer suitable habitation for birds. Verse 12. The Lord provides high mountains for the wild goats, trees for the storks, the sea for creeping things innumerable, and for Leviathan to sport in. What God makes, God gives. And what is humanity's place in all this? For one thing that strikes me in reading this is that people do not take center stage in this poem. You cause the grass to grow for the cattle, we read in verse 14, and plants for people to cultivate to bring forth food from the earth. But apart from the poet's opening, bless the Lord, O my soul, in the opening verse, this is the first mention of humanity. And it comes at roughly the halfway point, and only after we've read about every wild animal, wild asses, birds, and cattle, verses 11, 12, 14. People matter, but we are creatures among creatures. We are embedded poetically and literally within a much broader community. And we, like they, are dependent on God who provides us with food from the earth, with wine to gladden and bread to strengthen. Notice also the poet mentions 7 specific species in this beautiful poem. Wild asses, humans, storks, wild goats, conies, lions, and Leviathan. That there are 7 is suggestive, the number being associated with God's activities and with totality as in the 7 days of creation. That humanity is included in this group of 7 suggests kinship, a commonality among all having the breath of life. There is, however, one way we differ from other animals. The poem is almost entirely positive, except for its startling closing verse. And Sylvia actually walked us through this earlier this morning. Let sinners be consumed from the earth, and let the wicked be no more. It's a rather shocking way to end. Up to this point, it seemed nothing was wrong with the earth, and so this is unexpected. We're left to think, as Richard Bauckham observes, humans are the creatures who spoil the otherwise rosy picture of the world. Walter Brueggemann suggests that these sinners are those who, quote, who refuse to receive life and creation on terms of generous extravagance, no doubt in order to practice a hoarding autonomy in denial that creation is indeed governed and held by its creator, who will not tolerate violation of the terms of creation, which are terms of gift, dependence, and extravagance, unquote. To forget the earth is a gift, to deny that we are dependent on the creator and in community with the earth and all life on it, is to practice such hoarding autonomy. This is the fly in the ointment, the destructive distortion that so concerns the poet. Now that would be a rather depressing note to end on, so I'm going to swerve dramatically away from Psalm 104 towards an artistic alternative to the hoarding autonomy that Brueggemann describes. In 1944, Robert Lawson published his children's novel, Rabbit Hill, which tells the story of animals living near a long abandoned house. There are frequent rumors, references to food shortages among the animals owing to the owner's neglect of its once flourishing garden. But rumors are swirling among the creatures. New people are soon to arrive. There is excitement, but also trepidation. Will these new people, these new neighbors, bring guns, poisons, traps, aggressive dogs and cats? The small animals, including mice, rabbits, squirrels, are hopeful but cautious. And as it turns out, the new people are everything they wish for, and more, but both friendly and generous to the animals. They refuse to let the gardeners use traps. They help an injured rabbit on one occasion, and most surprisingly, they double the size of their garden and refuse to put a fence around it. All this puzzles the animals. What are they up to? What are these people up to? And why do they need such a large, unprotected garden? It's just 2 of them, kind of an Adam and Eve scene. The previous owners of the house were both indifferent and threatening to non-human life. Their neglect of the garden was an abdication of duty, an irresponsible human relationship with nature, or in Brueggemann's term, they practice a hoarding autonomy. Not so the new people, who embrace the land and its inhabitants, The story concludes when a large covered object appears in the yard. And if you've read it before, you're guaranteed to remember this. This is one of the most striking endings to a children's book. The curious animals gather to see its unveiling. It is Midsummer's Eve, which not only has long associations with magic and folklore, but is also a Christian festival, and perhaps importantly, at the festival of St. John the Baptist, the forerunner of Christ. When animals see the tarp removed from this object, what emerges is a forerunner of a different sort. Within the Christian tradition, the most familiar forerunner for those aspiring to serve creation is St. Francis of Assisi, the patron saint of animals. When the animals first see the statue of Francis uncovered, we're told, it was almost impossible to hear the sound of 100 little breaths, or it was almost possible to hear 100 little breaths caught and released in a sigh of awe. One of them explains the import of the moment when the blind mole asks Willie the field mouse to describe what he sees. Willie's voice was hushed and breathless. "Oh, Mole," he said. "Oh, Mole, it's so beautiful. It's him. It's him, Mole. It's the good saint. Him of Assisi? Him that's loved us and protected us, little animals, time out of mind. And oh, Mole, it's so beautiful. And all around his feet are the little animals. They're us, Mole, all out of stone." The statue is a fountain from which all are free to drink. Compare the language of Psalm 104, God making springs to gush forth, giving drink to every wild animal. And all around the pool are broad, flat stones, all set out with things to eat, like a banquet feast, left there for the animals to enjoy. Of course, the enlarged garden is for them too. Willie also notices there's writing on the statue. "What does it say, Willie?" The printing. Willie spelled it out slowly for the mole. It says, "There is enough for all. There's enough for all, Mole, and there is." God provides grass for the cattle, plants for humans, says Psalm 104, and there is enough for all. In this later story, St. Francis of Assisi is a symbol of another way of being human, one that embraces and even serves the earth community, recognizing there is enough for all and rejecting the hoarding autonomy the psalmist condemns. Thank you.
That's beautiful. Thank you so much, Michael. Well, Sylvia, it's come to you. Bring us home. Who owns the earth?
Okay. Thank you to all my panelists. John, as you began, I kind of realized that I don't look like anybody else here either, because I'm the shortest person at this table as well. Just kind of odd. You know, when you get a question like this and you look at who else is on the panel, part of what goes through your mind is, oh my goodness, we're all going to say the same thing. And as it will become apparent, none of us have said anything remotely like each other, which is what makes it an interesting panel. And I'm grateful for all these comments so far. So I don't know if I'll be bringing it home, but I'll certainly be doing something a little different than was said already. As I wrote these words, the waves were lapping on the shore outside my window. Having grown up in close relationship with Lake Ontario, for the very first time in my life, last week I was on the shores of Lake Superior, in a landscape very different than anything I had ever experienced before in Ontario. It had been a day of firsts. My first sighting of a northern parula and a Blackburnian warbler, the first time I ever heard a Swainson's thrush, the first time I'd ever seen bunchberry, which is very beautiful, or hawkweed blanketing the roadsides. And all day, I was pondering the question, who owns all of this beauty? Or as the organizers of the panel have framed the question of ownership, who is responsible for all of this beauty? Now, it's problematic, as I was sure others would point out, and indeed that has happened. It's problematic to even speak of ownership in relation to creation, even ownership by the creator themselves. And interestingly, even among artists, the idea of ownership is sometimes contested. and often answered in a way which suggests that an artwork took on a life of its own as it was being created. Anybody who's tried to write fiction has kind of realized, or not even fiction, anything, has kind of realized that as well. The language of ownership in our culture seems to imply control over more than responsibility, and here I dovetail with Dawn. So it's language that I suspect is fundamentally unhelpful for the discussion. It's also problematic to talk about who has responsibility for the earth, I think, if one takes seriously the way that the biblical story frames the relationship between the Creator and humanity and non-human creation. For the language of responsibility, I suggest, also has overtones of authority and power over, which do not adequately capture the complexities of the relationship between Creator and creation. So let me reframe this question by means of a brief exploration of how the biblical story describes the relationship between the Creator, humanity of the earth. And consistent with the question, I'm using the earth here to refer to non-human creation, realizing that there's more to non-human creation than the earth. There are the waters and the animals and the swimmers and the flyers. So there are a few themes I will weave together into a larger whole. First, from the outset of the story, there is a sense of partnership between the Creator and the earth and the waters. In Genesis 1:11, the Creator calls the earth to bring forth vegetation, plants that bring forth seed, and fruit trees with the seed in them. And the earth fulfills this creative request. In Genesis 1:20, the Creator calls the waters to bring forth swarms of living things. And the waters respond with great sea monsters and every living creature with which the waters swarm. I like that word swarm for what goes on in the waters, because sometimes you step into a pond and there's a weird feeling that things are swarming. This does not seem to be a relationship of ownership or even a relationship of the Creator's responsibility over all living things, but rather a relationship of mutual responsiveness. And that responsiveness can be seen throughout the biblical story. The Creator responds with grief to the violence done to the earth by the warlords and heroes of old in Genesis 6. When the pastures are destroyed and the land is ruined, the Creator weeps and wails in sorrow and lamentation throughout Jeremiah and in Romans 8. And if you were in Michael's session this afternoon, he has some of those passages listed in his chart. When the Creator comes to make all things right once more, all of creation responds with praise and joy. We see this in the Psalms and Luke 19, for instance, where Jesus says the rocks would cry out. So that's the first thing. There is this, seems to be from the outset, this mutual responsiveness. Second, this same responsiveness is seen throughout the story in the relationship between humanity and the earth and water. So my first point was between God and the earth. This is humanity and the earth. When Pharaoh uses the waters of the river as the instruments of death against the children of his slaves, the waters themselves turn to blood and later rise up against their oppressors when those oppressors enter the Red Sea. In fact, when Pharaoh acts as if he owns both the Hebrew people and the earth, not to mention the waters of the Nile, as it says in Ezekiel, when he does this by engaging in abusive agricultural practices and an extractive agricultural economy, the earth rises up against him. The water, the insects, the bacteria, the dust, the light itself, all respond by becoming instruments of death rather than life. The earth responded to injustice, to control and oppression, both in the ancient world as it does now. And similarly, when Paul describes the groaning of creation in Romans 8:22, he indicates that those who bear the fruit of the Spirit are those who respond to the groaning birth pangs of creation by joining in with that groaning, just as the Spirit of the Creator groans in solidarity with the suffering of the earth. So those who inhabit and are inhabited by the Spirit of the Creator are those who are responsive to the suffering of the earth. And third, throughout the biblical story, The earth, the waters, the trees, even the stars in their courses are subjects in their own right, creatures who have their own relationship with the Creator, apart from any mediation by humanity. The earth, the insects, the wild creatures described by Job, the waters of Lake Superior, the Blackburnian warbler, and the Swainson's thrush all have their own relationship with the Creator. A relationship, I should point out, in which they do not have names given to them by the men who discovered them. Swainson's thrush, Blackburnian warbler. At Curve Lake First Nation, which is nearby where I live, where the Mississauga Anishinaabe live, there is a young man who is recovering the Anishinaabe-Moan names of all the birds, decolonizing the names of the birds. And what he's discovering is that in the Anishinaabe language, the birds have names that indicate who they are in their creational context. What they look like, the plants that they're found on. It's a lovely picture of actually Psalm 104 kind of mutuality in creation. Moreover, the story seems to suggest that the relationship the earth has with the Creator might be responsible also for the healing of humanity. So at the end of the story, in the book of Revelation, when John paints a picture of the river winding its way through the food forest of fruit trees in the New Jerusalem, and when he describes the leaves of the trees as being for the healing of the nations, when John does that, he's bringing us back to the beginning of the story. At the outset of the story, the earth and the waters partnered with the Creator to bring life into being. At the end of the story, they partner with the Creator in bringing healing to broken creatures that have tried to take ownership and responsibility for the earth, but have failed miserably. One thing that we say in permaculture circles is that humanity has an unprecedented ability to affect the natural world, and it's matched by humanity's unprecedented ability to fail to predict the effect of their actions. Those disastrous effects are the result of a worldview of ownership. So where does this leave us? I suggest that rather than use the language of responsibility, we realize there is a certain responsive ability that we are called to. The relationship between the Creator and the creation is one of responsiveness. And the relationship between humanity and the earth, the waters, the skies, the crawlers, the four-legged, and the swimmers should also be one of responsiveness. We should be engaging with other creatures with the attentiveness and responsiveness that we apply to our other relationships, and that we should apply in our relationship with the Creator as well. If we are truly responsive to the beauty that we see on the earth around us, if we are truly responsive to the healing that the earth offers, if we are truly responsive to the suffering of other creatures and the waters and the earth itself, then we won't even need to ask questions of ownership or responsibility any more than my husband asks who has the responsibility to provide comfort when one of our children is hurt. We just step in and do what we can to provide the healing. I will admit, though, we used to have rock, scissors, papers contests occasionally when diapers needed to be changed. We weren't just, then responsibility was passed off. But normally we just step in if there's a need. And so it should be with the earth. When we are responsive to the needs of all creation, then we won't even stop to ask questions. We will just begin to provide healing and nurture. We will just begin to be the image bearers of the Creator that we were called to be.
Thank you
There's
so much.
There's your answer, Ryan. From all of us.
To be responsive. There we go. Well, thank you so much for all of those responses. And I think we'll take just a few minutes. Some of you might have questions for each other that have emerged from what you've been hearing, some resonances. I will take the moderator's prerogative here to kick us off. I heard between Don and Michael a kind of a connection around property being so Oliver O'Donovan talks about property this way as something that allows us to seek after the good of our neighbor, right? We have certain goods that we can kind of alienate in order to seek after the good of our neighbor. So very much the vision of these Franciscan farmers who are not hoarding, but rather kind of giving to all of creation, and your own remarks around that. And I'm wondering, though, if you've thought about how this might be modified by our history in this country and, of course, around the world, where this line of argumentation of let us alienate some property to seek after the good of our neighbor has often not actually been attentive to who is our neighbor. And I think, in particular, this line of argument by theologians was used and weaponized against Indigenous people to say, we can expand the common treasury of creation for all of Adam's children. But of course, those folks over there aren't Adam's children. I wonder what kind of limits there are to thinking about the good of property in the way that you've both kind of pushed towards, given this history and given our kind of repeated failure in identifying who all of our neighbors are that we need to be attending to.
Great question. Michael?
That's a hard one. Feel free to go first.
Well, I think one of the building blocks that I use, and certainly this is something that Sylvia has already made a reference to, and I think there's been 2 or 3 references during the conference, is that the perfect or the perfected state of the river city of the New Jerusalem doesn't really talk about ownership. It doesn't really talk about neighborliness. It just is. It is a perfected state of humankind, but it's not focused on humans. It's focused on the totality of the new creation. And the trees seem to be as valuable as the humans and the rivers, and we're not there. We just aren't there yet. So in the interim, what do we do? And this is where my argument about property being at its best, a method to allocate, to provide services, is the ideal, which often is perverted into something at its worst. And so my argument would be, if we are the perpetrators of that worst side of the spectrum, we should examine whether we're coming to the property system with a pure heart and clean hands. And if we're not, then we're responsible to God for changing that. And we all make mistakes. I fail consistently every single day, and my wife is a very gentle woman, but she can tell me that I do, and I know I do, and I suspect that we all do. So I'm thinking we're in a situation somewhere between needing a flawed system and making sure that it's not so flawed that it becomes a tool of significant oppression.
I was going to say something very similar, because you'd use that language of change of heart needed. So when we think about the earth and the little bits and pieces, as you put it, that we might actually claim to own, our own particular heart needs to be in the right frame. And if this includes, as you're suggesting here, if it includes abuses to the people that owned the land prior to us, building cities where nations used to live, that kind of thing, then we have to bring that kind of maybe humility into our claim of ownership. I was also thinking of the language of the terms hospitality and host kind of showed up too, and so hospitality in the sense of maybe recognizing that this little bit of land has had a very sad and troubled history. But I can hopefully be hospitable to those that have been harmed by my own claims to it. I'm not phrasing that very well. But yeah, that humility of heart does suggest a kind of a desire to make amends when there have been historic wrongs made.
John or Sylvia, did you want to jump on this one? You don't have to, but you're welcome to. You're welcome. Yeah. Okay. I think maybe we'll start at that end for questions. Okay. So, Michael, if you had a question that you wanted to put to the group for response.
Well, I had one for John that is just more of a thought that really kind of jumped out at me as you were presenting. You referenced to Jesus and the wild animals in Mark 1. The question just kind of came to me as I hadn't thought of this before, but who is the host in that moment? Is it Christ, or is it the wild animals that are? And it's such a intriguing moment in the God. And I think you're pointing it out. This happens right at the very beginning of the story, and then eventually Christ will go on to calm the sea and claim ownership in a different sense. But so more of a comment, not a question. But it does make me pause to think who actually is the owner. And I wonder again if those terms host and hospitality maybe are the animals hosting Jesus, or is it the other way around?
Just to piggyback on that, the word for Jesus being with them is actually a word that connotes deep friendship, actually. So it's this doesn't answer kind of the host thing, but does have this sense of a certain kind of mutuality and relationship between Jesus and the animals in that verse, which is quite lovely for setting off Mark's gospel in that way.
John, did you have a response to that?
Are we responding, or
you can respond to respond to each other's questions.
I don't know if I have a response, but I was just going to say a little bit of what Sylvia already said. That word "with" is actually very interesting, right? The English, we lose all of that, but when you go and look at those words, you're like, wow, those words actually mean something in the context. So maybe this is a little bit more and deeper than simply an interesting little, idea, right? There's something there, I think, that's worth exploring. My question or comment would be, I think, something like this. I was thinking about your remarks, Sylvia, especially about the how did you put it? I'll find it in a moment, hold on. Decolonizing the names of birds, right? I'm really drawn to that, decolonizing the names of birds. When I was in India during my undergrad days, there used to be two kites. One was a dark brown kite, and there was another kite which was mostly dark brown, except for its neck and head, which was white. And Indians, with our deep color-based prejudice, right? The names of the birds were very interesting. The brown kite was called the pariah kite. Now these are, right? And pariah is actually a caste-inflected term, meaning outcast, right? So this dark brown bird was called pariah kite, and this other kite, which had this white neck and head, was called the Brahmini kite, right? Indicating like a dominant caste status. And so when you were talking about decolonizing the names of birds, it made me think, wow, there's really something to it. And so I think the task ahead of us is just so multidisciplinary. And it is not the kind of task where, sometimes in creation care, I find this hierarchy of beings, right? Either humans are on top, right? Or the animals are on top, or the water's on top. Somehow it seems like we can't get beyond this hierarchy of beings, right? Well, humans are part of the creation too, right? And so your emphasis on kinship and responsiveness and mutuality, I think there is so much there to just unpack and discuss and feel deeply. That's what's standing out for me, I think. Yeah.
I'll just say something to that in a minute. I'll say something further about decolonizing the names of the birds, because what this young Anishinaabe man is discovering when he's going back to the Anishinaabe names for the birds isn't just that he's taking away those kind of colonial names, but also that the names reveal this deep relationality. So he's also realizing that certain birds appear on certain plants. So he's actually a herbalist and does medicine walks and things, and has realized that certain birds are always connected to certain plants. And so the birds, and the names of the birds sometimes give hints of that, but the birds often lead him to the plants that he's looking for, to the medicines that he's looking for, because he's discovering how deeply embedded and their relationality in the creation and in the the flora of the area. So it kind of brings us back to Psalm 104 again, which Michael and I should probably just team up and write about, since we have nicely overlapping stuff on it. But this idea that there is a home for all these creatures in creation, right? And they're in relationship to the mountains and to the streams and to the pastures, which is where we find some relationship too. And so this work that this young man is doing around decolonization is also highlighting those interrelationships between, that we tend not to think of too much. We go out bird watching and we're not thinking that we need to find these plants because then we'll find these birds, or if we find these birds, we'll find these plants. We're just heading out with our binoculars and Merlin on our phone, and we're just like, oh, there's an indigo bunting, and we're looking, kind of out of context, right? So it's just really, like, which is I feel myself convicted in that too. Whereas it's kind of dawning on me, I always see the eastern phoebe in exactly the same trees. Mm-hmm. Maybe those trees matter for me seeing the eastern phoebe all the time. We have a lot of phoebes at our place. Or maybe they're just the loudest. Because they're the loudest, they seem like we have the most phoebes. But so the idea of a multidisciplinary task in terms of decolonizing what's going on, that really does resonate too. We all need to be talking to the biologists and the birders and the entomologists, and all of these things link together.
Yeah.
I'll say one more thing.
Yeah.
I thought for years that I didn't realize that we had actually the red-belted bumblebee at our place until I discovered that it likes Joe Pye weed and marshmallow plants. Those are the only plants I see it on. So now it's like, okay, planted a little more Joe Pye weed and a little more marshmallow, and I'm going to see those bees, right? That kind of interrelationship is something that I think our ancestors knew a lot better, and we are fumbling our way to knowing these things about creation.
It's a great example of that responsiveness, right? You notice this relationship, and you're like, hey, I want to invite more of that, and so you planted more, and there it is, right? Don, do you have a question or a comment for the group here?
I do, and it's going to ultimately land on John's plate, but not until I've sort of had a chance to bring. I think there's a lot of commonality in what we're talking about, and so I hear things like "there is enough" from Michael. There is a sense of mutual. You didn't use the word respect. You used the word responsiveness, because it's much more active than respect. I can respect you and not do anything, but if we're mutually responsive, either as individuals or us in creation or us in God, there's a sense that we both have a role to play. And from that point of view, and certainly my perspective is this idea of property is not the problem, humility is the problem, and we don't have enough of it, so we need some more of that. So if we have enough and we have this mutual responsiveness and we come with a bit more humility, John, what are those small little steps, this smallness, the recovering deep emotions that we should do first?
Well, those three things that you pointed out, actually there are lots of commonalities. We could spend quite a bit of time actually talking about all the commonalities. Is there enough? I think there is enough, right? Like your closing statement, there is enough. And yet we operate with sometimes even like a theology of scarcity, right? I don't want to always blame somebody else who's not doing theology as the one with the narrative of scarcity.
Even theologians sometimes operate with with an idea of scarcity, right? Does heaven have gates? Is place scarce? So that scarcity thing is something I think worth digging deeper into. The respect versus responsiveness, I think things have been said and it's just like on point. But your question about property and humility is a good one. At Canadian Mennonite University in October, we had a theologian whose name is Willie James Jennings. He wrote a really great book called The Christian Imagination. He's written lots of other things too, but that one in particular. And he spoke about how actually maybe, okay, yeah, ownership, yeah, sure, He was like, you know what? Ownership is not as much of a problem. It's kind of what you're saying, right? Ownership is not as much of a problem as sharing. It's more difficult to share. So my response to you, like, what can we do a little bit of? I don't know, share a little bit. Just share a little bit. Like when I came to the United States for the very first time in 2010, I had a bag of chips and I want to give a disclaimer. I am not doing what you might think I'm doing, which is saying that Indians are better than Canadians. I'm not doing that. Okay, I will not do that because I know Indians are just as full of, But I had a bag of chips. And I was eating this bag of chips, right? And there's this guy next to me and I said, you want some? He's like, he was almost offended. He was like, how can you share your bag of chips with me? Because, dude, the next time you open up your bag of chips, I want some. Right? I really think it's more difficult to share. So what is the little thing? I don't know if I have a magic formula. Maybe I'll just give you 2 examples and then I'll stop. Both have to do with my immediate neighbors where we live. So in the winter, we don't have a snow blower, right? So just as you can see, I'm not much of a muscle guy, so it's hard work in the winter. But when I reach the border of my property though, right? When I reach the border of my property, like it kicks in, right? My property ownership kicks in. I'm like, I'm going to shovel exactly there. That's it. My property ends here, and that's where it's going to end. So I did that for the first winter. I did that. First winter there. I forget which year. And then I went back home. I was like, and the border ends exactly though where the neighbor's path is to their. There's a little path. That's their path. And I was like, oh man. So the next week, I shoveled their path just a little bit. I don't shovel the whole thing, but just their path. So my property and their path. That's one example.
That's good.
And the second example I'll give is this, right? So it's like, in Winnipeg, you don't know your neighbors. I mean, maybe you live in neighborhoods where you all know your neighbors. I live in a neighborhood where we don't really care about our neighbors so much. Now, in the summer though, it's a little bit interesting, right? The summer is interesting because everyone's out in their front yard and backyard, and that's kind of your display moment. Right, everyone's out and then you're kind of doing your own little gardening thing and sometimes you make eye contact with the neighbor and he's just like, hi. So the other day I made eye contact with my neighbor, right? I was like, hi. And he was like, hi. I was like, how are you? I'm good, right? And then I find out the guy had cancer, he got his intestine removed. Right? And I was like, oh damn man, like can I cook you something? And he's like, yeah, my wife doesn't like meat, but I love meat. I'm gonna cook you some meat for you. So I cook him some meat, I gave him a little something, and I don't know, I feel like the opportunities are there. It's not big, I'm not cooking, I don't have a meal plan for him, It's just a very little thing, right? So I can't even take so much pride in cooking one meal for this guy. But I don't know, the opportunities are there, I think. The little things are there, they're always there. So it's just a matter of just holding on to that thing, just reaching out for it. That kind of responsiveness, I think, that Sylvia's talking about.
Wonderful. Well, thank you all, and we still have some more time. So what we're going to do is we have a mic there set up in the middle. If you have a question, please come up to the mic, and if there's a line, that's fine. Just we'll make a little line. Sometimes it's helpful to write down your question so that you can find it quickly. So if you want to do that, you can. If not, feel free to come up, and we'll keep the conversation going a little bit. While they come up, I guess I'll kick it back to the panel with another question to give you guys some time to think. Let's see here. Well, okay, so we still have kind of skated around the question. We've relativized the question. We've gone around the question. We've said the question maybe doesn't matter all that much. One of the reasons why I wonder if the question does matter is because, so there is a thing that we sometimes do in contemporary theology where we will go around interpretation history. And we'll say, well, the Bible didn't ever actually teach this. The problem is, we've got 2,000 years of Christian history saying, no, the Bible very much did teach this. And one example of a very extreme version of what I mean here is Isaac Newton. Isaac Newton said, God does not name a set of kind of attributes of deity. What God names is dominion, the one who has ultimate dominion and is the dominator in chief, and in fact holds all the universe in its courses. So his theory of gravity, all of that kind of stuff, was a constant exercise of dominion, of this kind of ownership and control over. And this percolated through the work of John Locke and through many others, and has very much shaped our modern world. And so I wonder sometimes about these, we can maybe call this an errant interpretation of the tradition, but it has had this kind of significant feral afterlife, if we will. How do we, as Christians thinking about this question that we've tried to avoid this evening, how do we still take responsibility for these? Or do we simply condemn? What would your responses be to something like that?
I'm happy to start. So I think, because this came up in Michael's session this afternoon, why do we have certain, why do we not see the stories in the biblical story of, the animals, the other creatures, and dominion was raised as a reason for that. So I want to say something about dominion. I think we need to kind of redefine that word, redefine the idea of authority. Dominion is tied in with God's authority and ownership. You talked about how that's been interpreted as God holding the whole world together and making sure everything runs in its courses. And last night, I know you weren't here, Ryan, but we kind of addressed some of those theological ideas about God being kind of omnipotent and all the omnis that aren't really in the text, but are the theological constructs. I think part of what we need to do when we think about dominion and God's authority, God's dominion over the earth, is to ask ourselves what that looks like throughout the whole biblical story, right? It's the same question around the question of biblical authority, right? How is authority, how is God's rule manifest throughout the whole of the biblical story? And what we see is that God's power is shown. When in Exodus 34, when Moses says, I talked about this last night, when Moses is kind of begging God to still get back in the car and continue on the trip with the Israelites, and God's sort of hemming and hawing about that, and then Moses at a certain point says, "Can I see you?" And God says, "Well, I'm going to put you in this rock, and I'm going to pass by. And kind of, you're going to see the back of me as I kind of go by and cover the rock." And then God says, Yahweh, Yahweh. And the word Yahweh can mean I am who I am, but also I will be who I will be, right? Moses is going to see who God is. And God says, I will be I will be who I will be, compassionate and gracious and slow to anger and forgiving to the third and the fourth generation. And there's this, how does God use God's authority over the people, God's dominion in that whole narrative around the golden calf in Exodus 32-34? For forgiveness. Right? God again and again exercises authority by offering forgiveness to the people throughout the story, by offering redemption, by bringing healing, right? When you've got, now it's Ezekiel 34, when God is saying to the rulers, you rulers of Israel, actually it's say to the shepherds are the rulers, you did not seek the lost, bind up the wounded, feed the hungry, what are the other ones? Heal the sick, right? And then God says, but you didn't do it, so I'm going to do it. When I'm in control, when I'm the ruler, the vulnerable are cared for, the hungry are fed, the sick are healed, the lost are sought, right? Again and again in the story, till you kind of get the culmination in Jesus in, say Mark chapter 10, where Jesus is saying, you guys want to have authority? Well, this is, only the Gentiles have dominion kind of authority, to use that word, or exercise their dominion in being tyrannical over others. We exercise dominion and authority by being in service to each other, because the Son of Man is giving his life as a ransom for many, right? The cross is where we see how God has dominion and authority over creation and humanity, over the whole shebang. So, yeah, by all means, we could talk about we can use the language of dominion, but we need to radically redefine it in terms of the biblical story. This is what it looks like. This is what authority looks like. And it's fundamentally different than anything our culture, and especially these dead white guys who shape so much of our culture, I think it is.
Thanks. Well, I'll maybe give you the rest of you a chance, but I wanted to make sure, are there questions? I don't see a line yet. Oh, here we go. We got somebody coming. Good.
You've all said the question of ownership perhaps isn't the right question. Ryan, you've referred to O'Donovan's notion of ownership is something that you have in order to serve others from that place of ownership. I'm more concerned about those who have no ownership. I'm more concerned about those who are dispossessed rather than those who are possessed, who have possession. And when we think of that in terms of this broader cosmology of responsiveness, the way in which Sylvia was talking about it, the question then becomes, how do we possess our place in the world, or find our home in the world, in such a way that is homemaking for all? One of the crises, I work a lot on themes of home and housing and place, and you've worked a lot on place, and one of the crises and seems to be intractable problem is, does the possession of place by one people always necessitate the dispossession of that place from other people? And it's the same thing, I think, within the broader concept of the world. So if we want to experience that particular bumblebee at Russet House Farm, who owns Russet House Farm? Sylvia, Keesmaat, and Brian Walsh own Russet House Farm. But those bees kind of own the farm too. And we need to find ways to live in harmony with those bees and to create habitat, to encourage habitat, right? So it has to do, I think, less with a technical Western understanding of ownership and more a more holistic understanding of homemaking in responsiveness with all creatures. That's exactly what we find in Job. That's exactly what we find, I think, throughout the scriptures. That's not a comment. That's not a question, that's a comment. There you are.
Thanks, Ryan. Do you want to respond to that comment? Yeah?
Actually, this relates actually to the question I had for John, which when we were talking about considering the lilies, and you said all we need is to have hearts and minds open, but you also need lilies, right? And so this just piggybacks on Brian's comment about the dispossessed. You know, when, and I guess is my, I mean, I agree with you about starting and staying small, but the tension of that is that there are structural things that prevent people from having any kind of possession. There are structural things that exclude people from access to the lilies. There is, you know, the tar sands mean that at Fort Mackay First Nation, the people there do not have access to their blueberries or to their lilies or to the animals that used to feed them on the trap lines because of the tar sands and what's happening there. So there needs to be, I think, also responsiveness that actually is big picture, that is advocacy, that is trying for larger changes too. Intention, and I think both are necessary. I think the start small, but also there are some big things we need to be working at so that the people who are dispossessed have, and the creatures that are dispossessed. I mean, that question Brian asked about, you know, if some people have ownership, does it mean that other people are dispossessed or other creatures are dispossessed? Because that's how we function, right? Our society dispossesses other creatures. For us to eat, other things don't eat. One of the fields next to our farm is cash cropped by a farmer who grows soy there. And you go down to our pastures, which we rotationally graze, there are all kinds of creatures buzzing around the feet of the cows, and that's where the meadowlarks nest, that's where the bobolinks nest. That soy field is dead, right? And all those creatures have been dispossessed in that field next to us. So I've completely lost my train of thought, but there we are. I said a bunch of things there.
Don, you want to jump in?
Sure. I think perhaps. Now? Okay. And perhaps we often as humans think way too small. And if we're thinking of ownership, we think of ownership in a Western individual way, where I own my iPhone or I own my shoes, but there are a lot more relationships of ownership that we're part of. And I use this example, for instance, we have a dinner club, and we started it 21 years ago as maybe it would go two or three times, and we're on our 206th meeting. We meet 10 times a year, and we own, as a community, all of the frivolity and good food and good times in that particular setting. And that's something bigger than an individual ownership or a family ownership, which is our common legal definition of ownership. It's like, who owns that car? Well, I own that car. Whereas in a community, or a community garden is another great example. Who owns a community garden? Well, it's on the property of Pine Grove Bible Church, but we don't really own that in the same way that I would go to the land titles office and find out who owns the garden. And then the third community is, I think, and this is maybe what some of the things that you're thinking, and I'm not a theologian, I'm a Cartesian lawyer, and I think there's also a nascent international community that sees property and ownership differently than simply individual ownership. And as those concepts and those communities expand, they can be perverted, I grant that. They also can be new ways of expressing ownership. And if we are able to use those new communities to get to a new position of ownership or responsive ability or reciprocity or enoughness or humility, then we have a good possibility for future.
Thanks. Oh, Sheila.
I didn't write down my question. And I don't know if you even have a question, but musings, and I appreciate your response. And it's about the relationship between naming and control. And the background of this is that I'm trying to learn names of flowers and trees, and I walk in the forest, and can I name them? And I get frustrated with myself because I don't know the names. And so then I wonder, is my desire to know the names of these a desire to control or a desire to be in relationship? And I suspect it can be both, and maybe is both. But I've been thinking a lot about how when we name things, how much is that a desire to be in relationship? How much is an effort to control? I suspect it's both, but I'd be interested in your response.
That was a John, not a Don, right? I believe it was this side of the table.
Well, I could say something. I could say something in response to this, because I understand the naming thing entirely. I photographed a dragonfly out at the Boreal Ecology Center, which I've mentioned before, and it's weighing on me because I have not uploaded it to iNaturalist to find out what it's called. And I mean, I think part of naming isn't control. It's, I mean, we come to this conference, we don't know who people are necessarily, and the first thing we do is find out, oh, John, and so that we don't have to say, hey, you, right? It's easier to be in relationship if you actually know a name. And that's my experience with all of the creatures that we share Russet House Farm with, is that when I discover the names of these mosses and these mushrooms, which are the hardest things to kind of figure out the names of, I feel like when I'm out then in the woods that these are old friends now. These are because I know that's not just a moss, but this is, the beautiful Lischia, right? And this just isn't any mushroom, but this is the apricot jelly, which I think is a hilarious name. It's a very beautiful fungus. So at least that's what's part of it for me, but also it then helps me to know the other relationships that I was alluding to earlier, right? So, if I know that, Laurie's married to Gordon, then it's not surprising to see Laurie and Gordon together, or to know that if I'm going to come and stay with Laurie, I'm probably going to see Gordon hanging around, unless he's at a reunion with his cousins, as he was earlier this week. But knowing those, and I know where I'm going, where I'm going to find them, because I know where their house is. It's the same thing with knowing the names and being able to identify certain other creatures. I know where I'll find them, right? I know that I'm going to find the apricot jelly fungus on a dead cedar stump, right? And so suddenly I know something more about the neighborhood that I'm finding these other creatures in, because I know their names and the names of other things connected to them. Now, again, the names that they're given, these are colonial names, and particularly the Latin names come out of a certain tradition that is very abstract, I find. But in order to have certain conversations, you have to know the Latin names for things, and that's a challenge for me. Common names are a little easier. But I don't know if that answers your question, but for me it just seems like good manners. To know what things
and
are
I
called.
agree. Like you name your friends if you get to know them. But I realized I can love a flower even if I don't know its name.
Oh, certainly, yeah. Or even if you don't know, but there's still a way that you identify it for yourself, right? You have given it a name, even if that name's a concept, right? Like that purple flower that keeps growing up in between all the things I actually planted. And sometimes when you discover the name, you at least for me, I discover, oh, now it has a place here. I mean, for years I was uprooting things that I later discovered when I figured out what they actually were called. These were really important things to have on our property. And other things I discovered I should keep uprooting because they're invasives, but that's a whole other thing.
I think we got time for one last question. Yep.
I don't like having the last question, but I've just been sitting here thinking how words are so fraught. And I'm thinking words host and hospitality. And I'm thinking, oh, you know, hosts and people who are hospitable, that's a nice thing, right? But it also has this background of, oh, if I'm a host, that must mean I am the owner. And that I am working from a place of privilege. And I don't necessarily like that so much. And so I'm just wondering if, you know, conferences like this are partly about redefining words like host and hospitality to not mean ownership. You know, maybe to mean sharing, maybe something else.
Michael, you want to jump on that one? No. John?
Say a thing or two. I mean, words are so interesting, right? So your question, Ryan, is okay, when we look at a word like dominion or whatever, right? Are these relevant? Do they help us to do anything? I mean, sometimes I do think words matter. Like, don't get me wrong, I really do think words matter. I use a lot of words. I make a living using words. But sometimes also, you know, when Jesus says, wisdom will be proved right by her actions, I think there's something about actions that wins the day, you know? Like, I've been in many institutions where somebody will say something like this. You know, you're talking to your colleague and they refer to the custodian, right? People love referring to the custodian. They'll say, oh, you know the custodian? And they know the name. They know the names of the custodians, right? So now the person who knows the names of the custodians is now better than the person who does not know the names of the custodians, you see. But the person who knows the names of the custodians is a bit of a, you know. So now Anglicans have a hierarchy and all that, right? So, and Mennonites, you know, I work at a Mennonite institution. So Mennonites don't have any hierarchy. You know? Oh yeah. Yeah. So you know, so they're all servants. Like, you know, sure, words matter and all that, but sometimes I think how we are, who we are, right, as people get a sense of that over time, right? And so, so a word like dominion, I don't mind, you know. I'm with Sylvia on this. Sylvia didn't say I don't mind dominion, so I won't put words in her mouth. But God exercises authority, right? God exercises authority. But what does that feel like? It feels like, I mean, in repeating Sylvia here, it feels like forgiveness, right? It feels like relationship. It feels like sharing, healing. All of those things we have. It feels like mercy, right? It feels like mercy. The same word out of which we get womb and hysterical.
Yes.
Amazing what we've done with words, right? So at the end of the day, if these words don't translate into any actions that matter in some concrete way, where people feel good, where there is mutuality, where there's kinship, then, you know, we can use different words. I don't know if we get anywhere. And this is just a note for another conversation with anybody interested for another time. Oliver O'Donovan. The Anglicans love quoting Oliver O'Donovan. I don't like Oliver O'Donovan. I don't like him one bit. Just for the record. Okay.
Somebody else go.
Amen. Amen, brother.
Yes, but unfortunately, we both have had to write about him to move beyond. So, well, thank you so much to this panel. Can we give them a round of applause for their great work tonight? Thank you all for joining us for this conference. There's still a little bit more left. If you go just basically straight around that wall, there's another hall set up for us to have a little bit of a reception, a little bit of social hour. We can keep this conversation going. I'm sure that for every one of you who got up with a question or a comment, there are several more of you that have some other ones that you just didn't want to ask in front of the group. So this is your chance to do that. And then tomorrow morning, what time is the service tomorrow? 10:30. Sylvia will be preaching to kind of wrap things up for this year's conference. So, Scott, is there anything else I should highlight? Good to go? Come and eat. There is enough.